darf ich als nächstes vorstellen Herrn Dr. Petri Kalliomäki. Er ist aus Maryland, USA. Er ist aus Maryland, USA angereist, macht gerade dort seinen Postdoc und sein wissenschaftliches Forschungsgebiet beschäftigt sich mit der, letztlich mit der Infektionsübertragung, luftgetragene Infektionsübertragung in Gesundheitsgebäuden. Er hat zusammen mit der RWTH Aachern ein gemeinschaftliches Forschungsprojekt, Krankenhaussituation, Infektion im Krankenhaus in Finnland untersucht und gleichzeitig aber auch in Deutschland, und den ersten Teil übernimmt Herr Kalliomäki. Herzlich willkommen.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Guten Morgen alles. That's the only thing that I know in Germany. Like I said, I'm Petri Kalliomäki and I work in the University of Maryland as a postdoctoral associate in the School of Public Health in US. Before that, I used to work in Finland in Turku University of Applied Sciences as a researcher, and the project that I'm going to present today was carried out in Finland while I was still working there, and the name of the project was dECOnhealth, where we looked at the the potential of demand-controlled ventilation in healthcare settings. This project was carried out in collaboration between Germany and Finland, where in Finland the research was carried out by the Turku University of Applied Sciences, and in Germany it was carried out by RWTH Aachen University, so in Professor Müller's group. In this dECOnhealth project, we collaborated closely with healthcare settings and companies. The two hospitals that participated in this study were the Helsinki University Hospital in Finland and the Uniklinik Hospital in Aachen. In Finland, we collaborated with companies like Halton, Bravida, Pietico, Hermetel, and Ramboll, and in Germany with grants. This study was funded in Finland by Business Finland and in Germany by Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. This study started 2018 and just recently ended this spring 2022. That project actually included a lot of work packages, but today I'm going to talk about one of the work packages, mainly focusing on indoor air quality measurement campaign in the two mentioned hospitals. So here you can see the two hospitals. On the left side you can see the HUS, the Finnish side hospital called Triangle Hospital, and on the right side you can see the Uniklinik Aachen Hospital. So my presentation is focusing on the Finnish side, naturally, and so a little bit more about the indoor air quality measurement campaign carried out in the HUS Triangle Hospital. So that was the building in which the measurements were carried out. And the building was located in Meilahti in Helsinki. Meilahti has this big hospital district, and this university hospital building was one of the buildings in that area. The building was rather new. It was the construction was completed in 2010, and the building had 9 floors, 1 floor underground and 8 floors above the ground level. And in total, the area of the building was 21,600 square meters, and it had almost 1,000 rooms. The building had mechanical ventilation with 34 air handling units in total, servicing the whole building. And the space heating was supplied with water-based radiators, and cooling was supplied only through supply air. The air handling units were operating 24 hours per day, and they had constant flow rate on during the whole time. So During the measurements, we monitored 45 rooms in total. Mainly we focused on isolation rooms and also in patient rooms, but we also carried out IAQ measurements in offices, corridors, consulting rooms, treatment rooms, and so on. With the IAQ monitors, we were able to measure basic IAQ parameters like temperature, CO2, relative humidity, TVOCs, and pressure. This measurement campaign lasted 2 years, but I'm going to show in this presentation only the data collected in 2020. So first, the temperature measurement results. Here you can see on the left side 2 example rooms. So at the top you can see a 2-bed patient room, and the bottom you can see a 3-bed patient room in the examined hospital. And you can see the monthly temperatures in each of the example rooms. And what you can see in them is that in both rooms there was some variations in the monthly temperatures. However, if you look at the median temperatures, the black lines in the middle of the boxes, you can see that it was really stable. And in a good level, in a sense that it was somewhere around 22-23 Celsius degrees throughout the year. And on the right side, you can see all of the data combined together. So from all of the rooms, different space types, and all of the measurement sensors. And what you can see here is when we divided that all data into 3 categories, to summer, to spring and autumn, and to winter seasons, we can still see that basically we didn't see much variation in the temperatures. So basically they were really stable, and there were no seasonal variations in the temperature inside the hospital. Then humidity. Again, on the left, you can see 2 examples from 2 different patient rooms. Above, again, from the same 2-bed patient room, and below, again, from the 3-bed patient rooms, the relative humidity. But here you can see immediately that there's a trend in the humidity behavior. So what we can see is that during winter time and also during spring and fall times, we have really low humidity inside the rooms. But during summertime, we see a lot higher relative humidity inside the rooms. So basically this was caused because there was no humidification in the whole hospital. So the temperature, the relative humidity actually varied according to outdoor humidity. So that caused the changes in the humidity. And also on the right, you can see again all data combined together from all of the sensors and from all of the rooms, and divided into 3 different seasons: summer, spring and fall, and winter. And here you can see that the whole hospital building kind of depicted the same behavior as seen on the example figures. So that during summertime we had 50% or something like that relative humidity, but during winter and spring and fall times we had really low humidity inside the building. Carbon dioxide measurements. In this slide I'm going to only show you those 2 example rooms, and the summary and comparison can be seen in Professor Müller's presentation. But what you can see here, again, we have as an example, we have the 2-bed patient room and the 3-bed patient room. And what you can see on the left side is that the fluctuations are quite low. We have really low concentration, median concentration on the patient room, and also on the right-hand side. Although we have slightly higher concentrations seen, still the maximum values of the CO2 were typically below 800 ppms during the whole measurement campaign. So quite low CO2 values, which indicates that these rooms were quite well ventilated. So occupancy results. So we measured occupancy based on CO2 concentrations. And basically, if you know the flow rate and the emission rate of CO2 per person, you can estimate the occupancy in a certain space by calculating that value from the CO2 measurements. You also need to know a couple of other things, like whether the space was confined, so whether the doors were closed and so on. But luckily, in our case in Finland, in that hospital which we examined, typically all the rooms were closed. So because we had mechanical ventilation, they were not able to open the windows, and typically every time the nurses closed the door behind them, so the doors were also closed. So basically we had a confined closed space, and we were able to measure these occupancies based on the CO2 concentration quite accurately. So what you can see here is that the dark gray bar shows the unoccupied times, and if you look at the isolation rooms and patient rooms, you see that the unoccupied percentage is less than 20%. So basically they were almost fully occupied. Because you need some room for empty room for the hospital operations to carry on as planned. But if you look at the treatment rooms, consulting rooms, offices, and so on, you see that actually the unoccupied periods are much higher compared to the patient and isolation rooms. Typically, this was because the nature of these rooms, typically they were occupied only during regular office hours. So doctors were there only during regular office hours, but the ventilation was on still 24/7 all time. And so basically they were empty almost 2/3 of the time. But still they were used as planned, because they were planned to be used as a typical offices and in consultation rooms in the hospital. So they were not completely empty. So a quick summary about the IAQ measurement campaign at HUS in Finland. The room temperatures, as we saw, were on good level, and they did not fluctuate substantially between seasons. The relative humidity, on the other hand, varied greatly depending on the season. We found out that there was a low humidity during winter, spring and fall times, and higher humidity during summer times. And this was basically due to the fact that there was no humidification in the AHU system or in the HVAC system. So the CO2 concentrations were found to be quite low level throughout the year, so no seasonal variations there. And in general, occupancy was high in the monitored hospital, especially in isolation and patient rooms. But in offices, treatment and consultation rooms, the occupancy rate was notably lower due to their nature of their function. So the second part of the presentation deals with ventilation, air distribution, and healthcare worker exposure to exhaled breath of a patient. So this study was also carried out while I was still working in Finland. This was called the Airborne Project. And there we wanted to look more in detail what happens inside the rooms. Like mentioned before, ventilation and air distribution, as you know, is really important factor of good indoor air quality, and But when we looked at the hospital ventilation guidelines, we found out that typically guidelines recommend mixing ventilation inside patient rooms and inside isolation rooms. But is that enough? Do we mix the whole space with typical mixing ventilation, air distribution, and what happens closer to the patients? The healthcare workers do still go quite close to the patient when they have to give care to the patients. So what happens there? And if it's not well mixed, what could we do about it? And how should we solve this problem if there's any problem? So in this picture you can see illustration of what can happen during a typical mixing ventilation case. So there we have a patient mannequin, a mannequin simulating a patient lying on a bed, and then you have another mannequin simulating the healthcare worker standing next to the patient. And here you can see that the exhalation of the patient mannequin actually penetrates directly to the breathing zone of the healthcare worker. So actually what we then did in this study, we studied this typical overhead mixing ventilation, as can be seen on the left side, as a baseline case, what is basically suggested in the guidelines. And then we thought that how could we improve the situation? And then we thought that we should include a component with improved local mixing. So what we did was that we took part of the airflow in the overhead mixing ventilation case and supplied it directly downwards, not along the ceiling as in typical cases, but directly downwards to the patient bed area, and we're hoping that this would give us more local mixing in the area and hence reduce the exposure of the healthcare worker to the exhaled air of the patient. So in the study, this was carried out in a isolation room / patient room model in Turku University of Applied Sciences ventilation laboratory. And in the study, we used breathing thermal mannequins instead of real persons like healthcare workers and patients. And these mannequins were able to simulate realistic exhalation and breathing in and out, but also they had realistic thermal plumes so that they could take into account convective effects. So in this study, we basically used 4 different kind of methods. First of all, we carried out smoke visualizations just to illustrate the dispersal of the patient exhaled air, and so qualitatively assess the healthcare worker exposure, like we can see on the top picture there on the right hand side. Then we carried out also tracer gas measurements because we wanted to have some quantitative data about the exposure, and in the tracer gas measurements we dosed a tracer gas into the exhalation of the patient mannequin lying on the bed. And then we measured the tracer gas concentration from the inhalation of the healthcare worker mannequin. But also from other places as well, like from the exhaust, so that we could assess the exposure more in detail. Additionally, we carried out airspeed measurements to assess the air movement above and around the patient bed. And finally, we also carried out thermal comfort measurements with the thermal mannequin. So the more lifelike, sophisticated thermal mannequin, which in the upper picture you can see it standing next to the patient. That mannequin was able to measure PMV, thermal comfort itself, and what we did was we put it as a patient lying on the bed and also measured the thermal comfort of the patient. So like said, these are the two ventilation types that we wanted to test. So a baseline case, a typical overhead mixing ventilation where you supply the air along the ceiling, and then also a local downward ventilation case where you have the mixing ventilation as well, but then you have also a local downward ventilation component. And we tested these with different ventilation rates corresponding to regular patient rooms and for isolation room ventilation. So finally some results. First, the smoke visualizations. And in here on the left, you can see the baseline case, the mixing ventilation case with isolation room ventilation flow rates. And on the right, you can see the local downward ventilation case. And what you can see directly is that on the mixing ventilation case, the exhaled breath of the mannequin or the patient directly penetrates into the exhalation zone, breathing zone of the healthcare worker. However, on the local downward ventilation case, you can see that actually the exhaled breath is directed by the local downward ventilation away from the breathing zones of the healthcare worker and actually the mannequin, the patient mannequin as well. What we did in all of these studies with the local downward ventilation was that we kept the local downward ventilation component as a constant. So it was always 40 liters per second, even though we changed the total ventilation of the room. So, but still we kept always the local downward ventilation part at 40 liters per second. So air speeds and thermal comfort. On the lefternmost picture, you can see the air velocities or air speeds on a plane above the patient bed. You can see the frame of the bed and frame of the mannequin there, and like half a meter above the mannequin, we measured this plane and the velocities. And what you can see in the mixing ventilation case, that you didn't see high velocities there. However, in the local downward case, also seen in the smoke visualizations, you can see that there's a flow to the which actually hits the patient. So that's why we have higher velocities with the local downward ventilation case, reaching up to 0.3, 0.35 meters per second. However, although those are relatively high velocities, however, when we measure the thermal comfort, you can see over there on the right that with mixing ventilation, the PMV value was 0.1, and with the local downward ventilation case, it was minus 0.4. So both quite close to the zero, which is the neutral thermal comfort in this PMV index. So both were quite close to the neutral sensation. So quantitative tracer gas measurement results, and in this slide you can see the healthcare worker exposure in different locations inside the isolation room / patient room model. So on the left corner, you can see that we measured the healthcare worker exposure in 4 different locations, namely when the healthcare worker was leaning over the patient, and then when he was standing next to the patient bed, then when he was standing at the end of the bed, and finally when the healthcare worker was standing far away from the patient bed. And on the right, you can see the exposure results. I'm not going to go into the detail about the scale of the exposure, but what should be noted is that the higher the bar, the higher the exposure of the healthcare worker to the patient exhaled air. So in this figure, the blue bars represent the typical mixing ventilation case, and the orange bars depict the local downward ventilation case. And what you can see directly from there is that these obvious results result that the further away you go from the patient or the source, the lower the exposure. But what you can also clearly see that when the healthcare worker was close to the patient, giving care, leaning over the patient, the exposure was significantly higher with the typical mixing ventilation case. Or vice versa, it was significantly lower with the local downward ventilation case. More tracer gas measurement results. Now here you can see the healthcare worker exposure with different ventilation rates. So the previous results were done also with 12 air changes per hour, so basically with typical isolation room ventilation rates. But here we tested different ventilation rates, so to see how these two different air distributions would work, let's say in regular patient rooms and also in isolation rooms. So again, the blue bars represent the exposure in the mixing ventilation case, and the orange bars represent the exposure of the healthcare worker in the local downward ventilation case. And what can be seen here is that with both air distributions, when you increase the flow rate, you get a smaller exposure. That's obvious and well known. But here you can also see that with each of these different flow rates tested, you can see that the local downward ventilation actually produces a smaller exposure to the healthcare worker than the typical mixing ventilation case. So short summary about this ventilation, air distribution and exposure part. So the air distribution affects notably the healthcare worker exposure, especially close to the patient. And healthcare worker exposure close to the patient was found to be substantially higher than further away from the patient, especially with the mixing ventilation. Increasing the ventilation rate can reduce the healthcare worker exposure to the patient exhaled breath, even close to the patient. However, local downward ventilation was able to flush the healthcare worker breathing zone much more effectively, and hence reduce the healthcare worker exposure compared to the mixing ventilation case notably. And also the thermal comfort was found to be adequate with both examined supply air distribution modes. I'm going to stop shortly, but before I stop, I want to acknowledge the dECOnhealth project team members and collaborators, Hannu Koskela and Henna Maula in TURKU University of Applied Sciences, Veli-Jukka Anttila, Jani Valkama, Markku Ryytti, Juha Kata and Leo Sillanpää in Helsinki University Hospital, and then in the companies, Kim Hagström, Jarkko Kemppi, Anna Ylitokola and Mr. Sami Pietilä, and on the German side, Paul Mathis, Martin Ratz, Martin Kremer, Eckhard Fiedler and Professor Dick Müller. And also the funders, Business Finland and the participating companies. And on the second part, with the Airborne project, I want to also thank and acknowledge the team members, Mr. Hannu Koskela from Turku University of Applied Sciences, Matti Varis from University of Turku, and Dr. Julian Tang from University Hospitals of Leicester. And also the funder, the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health. That's about it from my part, and now I give the floor to Professor Dirk Müller.